Right now, somewhere in your city, someone is lighting up. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's your neighbor. Maybe it's legal where you live. Maybe it's not. But either way, it's happening right now in millions of living rooms and parking lots and back porches around the planet. And here's the thing you probably never think about while you're doing it. You're not doing something new. You're not even doing something modern. You're doing one of the oldest things humans do with plants, period. Older than beer, older than writing, older than farming, older, possibly, than the wheel. So the question is, when did this actually start? When did some ancient human first figure out that this particular plant did something different to their brain than every other plant around them? And how did we go from that moment to legal dispensaries with mint-flavored vape pens? Let's go back, way back, the plant before the high. Here's where most people get it wrong. They assume cannabis has always been the weed plant, something humans grew specifically to get stoned. But that's not how it started at all. Cannabis is, botanically speaking, kind of a supermodel. It does everything. The stalks make incredibly strong fiber. The seeds are packed with protein and oil. And only certain strains, under certain conditions, produce enough of the compound we care about, THC, to actually get you high. So for a huge chunk of early human history, cannabis wasn't a drug. It was a tool. Archaeologists have found cannabis fiber in pottery in what's now Taiwan, dating back roughly 10,000 years. Not weed, rope, cloth, cordage. The boring stuff that actually built civilization's nets for fishing, fabric for clothing, twine for tying literally everything together. Think about that for a second. The plant that ends up on a t-shirt with a leaf on it today started its relationship with humans as hemp string. But somewhere along the way, somebody noticed something else about this plant. Something the fiber couldn't explain. The mountains where it all changed. Fast forward, or actually, not forward, further back into the story, because this next part might be even older than the rope. Researchers studying cannabis genetics, including a major 2021 study led by botanist Luca Fumagalli, traced the origin of the cannabis plant itself to the high plains of what's now northwestern China, near the Tibetan Plateau. This is cannabis's ancestral homeland. This is where the wild version of the plant first evolved, millions of years before any human ever touched it. And it's not a coincidence that this region keeps showing up in the story. Because thousands of years later, in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, archaeologists dug into ancient burial sites called kurgans, stone tombs built for the dead, and found wooden braziers, basically ancient incense burners. Inside them, burnt stones and charred plant residue. When scientists tested that residue in a 2019 study published in Science Advances, led by archaeologist Meng Ren and colleagues, they found something remarkable. The chemical signature matched cannabis, and not just any cannabis. This was cannabis with unusually high THC content, meaning it had likely already been selected, intentionally or not, for its psychoactive punch. The site is called Jirzhan Cemetery. The date: roughly 2,500 years ago. That's ancient humans, in a funeral ritual, burning high-potency cannabis and inhaling the smoke on purpose. Not for rope, not for seeds. For the high. The problem with who was first. Now, here's where it gets messy, because who did it first is basically the most contested question in all of archaeology. Every time someone finds an old artifact, someone else finds an older one. And that's exactly what happened here. Because while Jirzhan gave us clear proof of intentional cannabis smoking around 2,500 years ago, there's earlier, blurrier evidence that pushes the timeline back even further. Ancient Chinese pharmacological texts, later compiled but based on oral medical traditions, describe cannabis being used for pain relief, for treating gout, for malaria, even for what sounds suspiciously like anesthesia during surgery. Some of this tradition is credited, maybe mythologized, to a legendary physician named Hua Tuo, who lived around 200 AD and is said to have used a cannabis-based concoction called ma fei zan to knock patients out before operating on them. Before modern anesthesia even existed, someone in ancient China may have been using weed to perform surgery. Let that sink in for a second. But here's the pivot. Here's what makes this whole story bigger than ancient people like to get high. This isn't just a drug story, it's a medicine story. This is the part that gets left out of basically every stoner history meme on the internet. Cannabis wasn't just a party favor for ancient people. It was medicine. It was ritual. It was, in a lot of cultures, sacred. The oldest written pharmacological text in the world, an ancient Chinese medical compendium traditionally attributed to the legendary Emperor Shennong, though actually compiled centuries later, probably around the 1st or 2nd century AD, lists cannabis as a treatment for over 100 different ailments. Pain, rheumatism, absent-mindedness, believe it or not. Meanwhile, on the other side of Asia, ancient Indian texts were describing cannabis under the name bhang as one of 5 sacred plants, tied directly to the god Shiva. It shows up in the Atharva Veda, one of the oldest religious texts on Earth, compiled somewhere around 1500 to 1000 BCE, where it's described as a source of joy and liberation from anxiety. So we've got China using it as medicine, India treating it as divine, and that's before we even get to the part of the story most people actually associate with ancient weed culture, the Scythians, the people who invented the stoner tent. If you've ever seen a meme about ancient people getting high in a tent, this is where it comes from, and it's real. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BC, described a nomadic warrior culture called the Scythians, who lived across the steppes of Central Asia. According to Herodotus, after burying their dead, the Scythians would set up small tents, throw cannabis seeds onto heated stones inside, and sit around inhaling the smoke. He wrote that they would howl with pleasure at the vapor, which, honestly, sounds like the most accurate ancient description of getting stoned in a tent with your friends that exists in written history. For centuries, historians treated this as a myth, a weird exaggeration from a Greek guy who liked telling wild stories about foreigners. Herodotus wasn't exactly known for fact-checking, but then archaeology caught up with him. In the 1940s, Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko excavated frozen tombs in the Pazyryk Valley in Siberia, tombs so cold, so perfectly preserved, that organic material survived for over 2,000 years. Inside, Rudenko found exactly what Herodotus described: small tents, braziers, burnt cannabis seeds. Herodotus wasn't exaggerating. He was reporting. That's a 2,400-year-old drug ritual, confirmed by frozen archaeology. Why this matters more than you'd think. Okay, so here's what makes this genuinely important, beyond just ancient people got high too. Cannabis use appears independently in multiple ancient cultures across thousands of miles: China, India, Central Asia, later spreading into the Middle East and Africa, all discovering, on their own, that this specific plant did something to the human brain that other plants didn't. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. And the pattern tells us something about the human brain itself. We are, as a species, wired to seek out substances that alter consciousness. Alcohol, cannabis, psychedelic mushrooms, tobacco, different chemicals, different continents, different eras, same underlying drive. Something in us has always wanted to change the channel in our own heads. Anthropologists sometimes call this the human psychoactive drive, the idea that seeking altered states isn't a modern vice, it's an ancient, near-universal human behavior baked into how we relate to plants and to each other. Which reframes the whole question, doesn't it? It's not why did ancient people get high. It's why is getting high one of the most consistent human behaviors in the archaeological record, from sacred smoke to side-eye. So, if it was medicine, ritual, and religion for thousands of years, how did it become the thing that gets you side-eyed, arrested, or worse? That part of the story is way more recent and way more political than most people realize. Cannabis moved through the Islamic world starting around the 8th to 10th centuries, often as hashish, and became deeply embedded in Sufi mystical practice, used in some circles as a tool for spiritual reflection. It spread into Africa, into the Caribbean through colonial trade and forced migration, and eventually into the Americas. For most of that journey, it stayed medicinal or ritual. In the 1800s, cannabis extract was a completely normal item on American and European pharmacy shelves. Doctors prescribed it. It was in tinctures. It was, for a while, just medicine. Same shelf as aspirin. The dramatic shift, the criminalization, the stigma, the decades of reefer madness, that's a 20th century story, tangled up in racism, immigration, politics, and international drug treaties, not ancient wisdom. In other words, humans spent thousands of years treating this plant as sacred, medicinal, and communal, then spent less than 100 years treating it as a crime. And now, we're watching that reverse in real time, with legalization spreading state by state, country by country, like some kind of cultural boomerang finally coming back around to where it started. So here's the full picture. Cannabis started as rope and fabric 10,000 years ago in ancient Asia. Then it became medicine, showing up in the oldest pharmacological texts on Earth. Then it became sacred, tied to gods, rituals, and grief. From Chinese healers to Hindu scripture to Scythian funeral tents frozen in Siberian ice for over 2,000 years. Then, for one strange century, it became a crime. And now, it's becoming whatever it was before: medicine, ritual, recreation, all of it, all over again. So next time you or someone around you lights up, you're not doing some fringe modern thing. You're doing something ancient humans on 3 different continents independently figured out was worth doing, worth ritualizing, worth writing down, worth burying with their dead. That plant has been in the room for grief, for pain, for celebration, for surgery, for worship, for thousands of years before anyone ever called it a drug. Maybe that's the real story here. Not that ancient humans got high, but that from the very beginning, humans have never just wanted to survive. We've always wanted to feel something different, on purpose, together. If you want more stories like this, the weird, human, wait, that's actually true? Side of history, stick around. There's a lot more where this came from.